kiln's still a little bit hot. I'll come back in an hour or so. Okay, that's a bit more like it. Now let's open him up. No disasters. Amazing. I'll just unload this lot and we can get started. Hello lovely folks! Today I'm going to talk to you about glazing and how I glaze my pots. So there are so many different ways that you can glaze. This is just how I do it. So I'm going to take you through how I dip glaze, how I pour my glaze. I'm going to talk to you about how I prepare my bisque beforehand and a few tricks along the way to make sure your glazing goes really smoothly. I know loads of potters really hate glazing, and that's because it can make or break a pot. It took me a long while to get into the flow of glazing and to find my own rhythm with it, find the things that work for me. It's probably going to take you a while to get into your own rhythm of glazing, to find the colours and the effects that you really like. My top advice would be, before you commit to glazing your pots with a new glaze or a new technique, test it. Test it on a test tile. You won't be so upset if that goes wrong. If you commit and put a new glaze onto a whole batch of your work, it's really disappointing if it doesn't turn out quite the way you want it to. The tools I use for glazing are a jug, a turntable, wax, a hand blender, maybe some tongs, some diamond pads, a bucket, a sponge, and some paintbrushes. First step, I sand my bisque. Now I normally do this with a big bucket, but I'm going to do it with a smaller, clearer container so you can see today. So I've got water in this container, and it's really important that you sand your bisque wet. So after I've got my bisque out of the kiln, I lay it out like this and I'll give it all a really good look over. I'll look at the handles, I'll look at the bases, just to check for any cracks, any warping, because if there's something which is cracked, which, you know, is a big crack, there's no point in me spending time sanding it and glazing it. So that will go in the rejects pile, and I'll probably will glaze it at some point, but I want to put all my energy into the things I know are going to come out looking amazing. So this one looks pretty good. There's no cracks by the handle, there's no warping, and there's no cracks on the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to check it for any kind of rough patches. So the reason why we do this is because any kind of burrs or any like knobbly bits, any rough bits, any kind of loose bits of clay that might have got stuck to the greenware before it went in the kiln, they will show through glaze and they will give you a really untidy result. I like to use these diamond sanding pads. I bought these probably 6 years ago and they've lasted so long. I'm just going to dunk my pot into the water, and any kind of rough bits, I'm going to dip my sanding pad in the water too. Any rough bits, I'm just going to sand those lightly back. As you can see, after every kind of couple of scrapes, I dunk my sanding pad back in the water just so that any dust goes in the water and not into the air. There's a little bit on the bottom, just going to sand that back. When I'm kind of happy that I've done that, I'm going to take my sponge and I'm going to get it really nice and wet, and I'm just going to give it a nice good wipe down to get any of the dust off that I might have just created in the sanding process, because you don't want dust on your bisque, because that will create a barrier between the glaze and the pottery and it will cause all sorts of problems. And there we go, so I'll put that one over there to dry. Now I'll work through this whole batch methodically, one by one, making sure that everything is nice and smooth before I go on to the next stage. Another little tool that I like to use is this little sanding stick. I've spoken about it in a previous tutorial. It's one of my favourite tools ever. It probably cost me about £6, but it's lasted years. It used to be much bigger than this. It was about this big. But this little tool is really great for getting into edges. So as you can see, there's a foot on this little you-know-me, and I can put my sanding stick right in the groove of the foot and get any kind of burrs or snaggly bits or rough bits or sharp bits out of there. And also I can go inside the pot as well, which I can't do as easily with the sanding pads. So this is a really, really good tool. Once I've worked through the whole batch of bisque, making sure I've got through every single last form and give them a nice rinse, then I'll move on to waxing. So waxing is where you use something called a wax emulsion resist. You've probably all heard about it before, but I think it's a really important tool. You have to be careful with wax. If you get it on any area of the pot that you do want glaze on, it's gonna create an instant barrier, and the only real way to get that off is to bisque your pot again. To make sure that I don't get the wax anywhere that I don't want it, I move all of my bisque to one side of my workbench, out the way, so there's no risk of splashes. I'll use a really soft brush with my wax. So I'm gonna glaze this little pet bowl for you here, and I'm gonna use the wax on the bottom of the base because I don't want any glaze to go on this part of the pot. Really carefully just go around the entire base, making sure that I get wax on every piece of surface that I do not want the glaze to adhere to. And then when I get to the edge here, I'm gonna go really carefully because that's the place where mistakes can easily happen. And I like to rest the bisque on the table because if I'm holding it up here, there's more of a risk of me kind of wobbling around. So I'll just rest it gently on the table surface. I'm gonna leave that to dry. Now once I've waxed everything that I want waxed, I'm gonna move on to prepping my glaze. So this little pet bowl is gonna have two different glazes on it. It's gonna have this one, which is the clear interior glaze, and then this one, which is a white glaze, and it's going to go on the outside. Always do the liner glaze first, just because I find that easier that way. And it means that if I make any mistakes on the outside, I can still use my sponge to wipe it away. So I'm going to take my blender, my stick blender, and I'm going to whisk this glaze for at least a minute. Now it's really important to keep stirring your glaze, and I normally use my stick blender kind of in between every single pot, just because those particles, they'll settle again. They'll settle really quickly because they're heavier than water, so they'll end up at the bottom of your bucket, not in the suspension that you need them to be in. You really don't want your transparent glaze to be too thick because it can go bubbly and cloudy and not look great. That's why you want a transparent glaze to be as thin as possible. And the way to do that is to be quick. I'll get my glaze in my jug. I'll make sure I've got enough of it because it's much easier to be quick when you can just fill the form right up to the top rather than having to put in a little bit and then swirling it around. That's fine for coloured glazes, but when you want a thin layer like this way is much better. Make sure that I've got enough glaze in my jug. I'm going to pour it in as quickly as possible, all the way up to the top. Just give it a little move around and then pour it out. I'm going to keep my mug upside down just until most of that glaze is dry. It's really hot today, so it's drying really quickly. And then flip it back up, give it a check, and any drips, just gonna wipe away. And then I'll leave that to dry. I'm gonna work through the rest of this work and come back to you once I'm ready to glaze the outside. Now you want to clean your tools in between glaze colors because you don't want any cross-contamination. So I'm going to clean my water, clean my sponge, give my desk a little bit of a wipe down, and then I'll move on to the white glaze that I'm using. Now this is a commercial white glaze, and I have used it for years. It's really reliable. It's a shiny white stoneware glaze. The reason why I buy in commercial glaze for my white glaze is because white is kind of white and what I want it for, I just need it to work every time, so that's why I buy in this commercial glaze. It doesn't need to be fancy, so that's why I don't make this one. I make my clear glaze because I use a lot of it, so it's actually cheaper to do it that way, but I don't make the white. Yeah. You might want to wear an apron when you're glazing as well. It's okay, these are old clothes. So noisy. There we go. Okay, my glaze is mixed. Coloured glazes are a little bit different to clear glazes. You want the layer to be a bit thicker than a clear glaze. So I'm going to get my pot, and you might think, Cara, how are you going to dip that in without getting your fingerprints on it? Well, some people would do that and call that a mark of kind of the process, but I don't want that. I want a nice clean exterior of my bowl. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to check that I don't have any kind of debris on the bottom because I don't want it to go in my glaze. I'm actually going to hold the bowl like this with my hands, kind of inside, my fingers inside the bowl, putting kind of like outward pressure so I can actually dunk the bowl into the glaze without getting any finger marks on the outside and not ruining my liner glaze as well. Okay, so I'm gonna dip my bowl, making sure I've got nice tension on it, and push it down evenly all the way around, really carefully, slowly does it. I'm gonna hold it there for at least 3 seconds, and then I'm gonna pull it out slowly and let all the drips drip off the bottom. And as you can see, there's a lot of glaze left on that base, and I don't want that because obviously this bowl will stick to the kiln shelf. I'm going to take my sponge and I'm just going to wipe that off while it's wet because that's easier than leaving it to dry and then doing it. There we go. I'm going to give it a little check around. As you can see, there's a little bit of glaze missing there. So I'm going to get a paintbrush and I'm going to stir my glaze. I'm going to drop some glaze onto that missing bit and then wait for that to dry, and I will just soften the edges of that little drip there to make sure that it blends in with the rest of the glaze. And I do that just using my finger. I'll just kind of gently rub over it once it's dry. So as you can see, there's this dunk has left some glaze drips here, and those will actually show on the final piece, and I don't want that. So I'm going to take a little scraping tool like this one, and over my bucket I'm just going to scrape that drip back really carefully because I don't want to go through the layer of glaze, and just get rid of it. And then use my finger just to smooth that out. Now the glaze isn't completely dry yet, so there isn't a lot of dust being created, but you could wear a respirator if you wanted to do that. Also, here's my the missing bit of glaze that I had before, so I'm just again going to use my scraper and level that off and make sure that is nice and flush, and that's not gonna be unsightly when it comes out of the kiln. As you can see, now I have a little rim around the top of the bowl, and to get rid of that I'm just going to dip it back into my glaze just really quickly using one hand. Really carefully make sure that the bowl is in the glaze all the way around, hold it for 2 to 3 seconds and then pull it back out. Just going to wait for that to dry. There we go, and now that rim is glazed and my bowl is ready to dry and then go in the kiln. Another method of glazing the outside of your pots is by using a turntable like this one, putting your bucket of glaze on the turntable and using some kind of props. I'm using chopsticks here just because they're the same kind of width and size. And I'm popping them on the bucket of glaze. This is my, this is another pet bowl. So this is going to go facing down in the center of the bucket, as close to the center as I can. And make sure that it's resting evenly on the chopsticks. I have my glaze here that I've already mixed. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the jug in my right hand because I'm right-handed and that's easier to control. And I'm just going to pour around the glaze, around the outside of the pet bowl, and turning the turntable with my left hand at the same time. It doesn't matter if it goes on the base because it's not going to sink in because of the wax. And I'm going to go around twice to make sure that the layer is thick enough. There we go. I think that's all the way around twice. And that's a really neat way of glazing the outside of your pot and avoiding getting any glaze on the inside. I'm just going to wait for that to dry before I touch it, and then I will just pour the excess glaze that's on the top here back into the bucket, give the bottom a wipe, and then I will dunk in again how I did before, using one hand just to glaze that rim. So another method of dip glazing is by using tongs. Now these work great for things like plates or mugs or kind of bigger forms, and it allows you to dip the entire form in the glaze and not have finger marks. So, oops, you get the plate, the form between the prongs, and you have to make sure that you hold it firmly but gently. Sometimes you can accidentally crush the form with the tongs, and you don't want that. You want to get your glaze bucket and your piece, and you dip it into the glaze, going all the way in, wait 3 seconds, and then pull it out. So this method is great and it's quick, but it only works if you have a big enough bucket of glaze and if the glaze is really full in the bucket, because if you try and dip a form into a half empty bucket of glaze, you're only going to able to glaze one half of it, and you will get a line if you kind of take it out and then put it back in the other way. I don't tend to use this method very often because I tend to make my glazes in smaller batches. When you're trying out glazes you might find the same, but it's really great if you've got a standard glaze that you know you use all the time, and you can make a really big batch of it, and you can use the tong method to dip your pots and glaze them really quickly. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. As always, if you have any questions about this or anything else, then pop them in the comments below and I will get right back to you. I've had to move over to this corner of the studio to escape the sun. My camera actually is overheating, hence why I'm squished up in the corner. But thank you so much for all of your support this month. It really means the world. Hope you stay safe wherever you are in the world, and happy potting! Bye!